Welcome back, everyone. Our next headliner is on the subject of design justice, community-led practices to build the worlds we need. Here to share the thoughts, I'm thrilled to welcome Sasha Constanza-Chock, author of Design Justice and Senior Research Fellow of the Algorithmic Justice League. Sasha is a scholar, activist, and media maker, and currently Associate Professor of Civic Media at MIT. They are Faculty Associate at the Bartman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, Faculty Affiliate with the MIT Open Documentary Lab and the MIT Center for Civic Media, and creator of the MIT Co-Design Studio. Sasha's work focuses on social movements, transformative media, and design justice. And Sasha's first book, Out of the Shadows into the Streets, Transmedia Organizing and the Immigrant Rights Movement, was published by MIT Press in 2014. Welcome, Sasha.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and to be part of this conversation. I'm here in part to talk a little bit about my latest book, Design Justice, Community-Led Practices to Build the Worlds We Need. And that was published by the MIT Press this year. And that book is an extensive reflection on questions about the relationship between design and liberation. And in the book in particular, I'm exploring questions about values. So what are the values that we encode and reproduce in the tools and objects and systems like AI that we design? Practices and who gets to do design. Narratives, or what stories we tell about how things are designed. Sites where we do design and how we make those more accessible, especially to those who will be most impacted by design processes. And pedagogies, or how we teach and learn about design justice. And the whole book, it's based on my experience as a practitioner and also as an educator. And it's all available for free at design-justice.pubpub.org. So it's freely available, open access, thanks to the MIT Press. Of course, design justice isn't a term that I created or just came up with. It's a term that comes from a growing community of practitioners, folks who are focusing on more equitable distribution of design's benefits and burdens, more meaningful participation in design decisions, and recognition of community-based, indigenous, and diasporic design traditions, knowledge, and practices. And so this is a growing community of design practitioners in many different fields, including graphic design, interaction design, HCI, artificial intelligence, urban planning, design of the built environment, and many other design domains. And this is a growing community of folks who are working with social movements across the United States and around the world. And many are affiliated with the Design Justice Network. And you can learn more at designjustice.org. And so what I've learned from that community is that design justice is a framework for analysis of how design of images, interfaces, objects, the built environment, socio-technical systems more broadly, and artificial intelligence influences the distribution of benefits and burdens between various groups of people. And unfortunately, often those who are involved in the design of systems are those who already occupy privileged positions within what Black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins calls the matrix of domination, which is her term for the intersection of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, settler colonialism, or you could think about it in terms of race, class, gender, and disability. And so those who are most privileged within that interlocking matrix of race, class, gender, and disability are too often those who get to design systems that then impact potentially harmfully or in negative ways those who occupy less privileged positions within that matrix. But today I'm not going to talk that much about the book. You can read it. It's freely available at that link that I shared earlier. You can just Google the book. And you can also see in-depth talks that I've done about that book just on my own site or by looking for talks of mine about the Design Justice book. So what I'm going to do today is I'm really pleased to share some new findings from research into the state of emerging technology in the public interest that was deeply informed by the design justice community and the design justice framework for analysis. And this report is called Pathways Through the Portal. It's a field scan of emerging tech in the public interest. And it was created by Diana Nacera, Barhan Tai, myself, Mika Sifri, and Matt Stempek. And it's a production of Civic Hall, which is a New York-based civic technology organization, with support from the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, and the illustrations and layout are by Silver Sterling. The world is deep in the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic, a historic uprising for Black liberation in the United States, and many other instances of social unrest and mobilization towards ecological sustainability or survivability. So it's a time of great crisis, it's a time of reckoning. But as Arundhati Roy writes, the pandemic might also be a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And she says that we could choose to walk through that portal, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, avarice, data banks, and dead ideas, dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we could walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And emerging technologies, especially AI, would clearly be important to our passage through this portal. Can we develop new tools that allow us to live with a degree of safety from COVID? Can we ensure that technologies we develop don't unintentionally reinforce anti-Blackness and other forms of structural inequality? Which of so many potential futures do we want to build together? In an effort to develop some signposts to help guide us along that journey, together with the other researchers I mentioned before, we gathered a group of researchers, technologists, and community organizers to explore the potential for emerging tech in the public interest. And we paid attention to a number of different emerging technologies, especially AI, machine learning, natural language processing, automated decision support systems, bots. And we looked at some other tools, including AR and VR, drones and remote sensing, and satellite imagery. But we really focused more on the types of M-tech that's most likely to be accessible to public interest organizations. And so we were looking for existing efforts to use M-tech in the public interest and synthesize some lessons learned and mark some possible pathways forward. So we conducted a broad literature review, interviewed 24 field leaders, and developed a database of organizations and resources. And we found cause for both caution and optimism. We synthesized our work into 7 key findings and recommendations. And the rest of my time here today, I'm going to present a little bit about those. Just quick summaries, and of course you can dive into them in the full report. First of all, a lot of practitioners that we talked to felt like it's important to do no harm. So John Callery, who's the Vice President of Technology at the Trevor Project, said, quote, "I think it's so easy to create a machine learning model. It's completely different to make sure that it's fair and doesn't have harmful effects." And the Trevor Project received a $1.5 million Google Impact Challenge grant to develop a crisis intervention platform for LGBTQI+ youth. And they're using machine learning to prioritize young people who might be at the highest risk of suicide, so that they're first in the queue to reach trained counselors on their chat line. And they felt they needed to use UX research to inform the development of a product that wouldn't inadvertently cause harm. So you could imagine how a triage system powered by machine learning might inadvertently misclassify certain types of callers or young people who are chatting in if it wasn't trained on a broadly inclusive data set. And the last thing that you want would be to inadvertently deprioritize, say, young Black LGBTQ people because you didn't include them in your test data or in your benchmarks on proper classification for triage. And in general, we think that this applies across the space. So emerging technologies might offer great potential for helping to mitigate and reduce harms, but there's a huge and growing body of scholarship, practitioner knowledge, and lived experience that demonstrates that powerful actors who are designing AI systems too often are using them to harm Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQI+ folks, disabled people, immigrant people, other marginalized communities, whether or not those harms are intentional. So we need to have more widespread adoption of much better design processes, independent audits, and stronger regulatory oversight. And public interest organizations in particular have a responsibility to reflect on and, where possible, repair past harms, and to actively consider possible future harms before developing or deploying new systems. It's not a checklist, it has to be integrated throughout the field. And so, for example, in my other role at Algorithmic Justice League, where I'm a senior research fellow, this is an organization founded by Joy Buolamwini, who's known for her work demonstrating intersectional skin tone and gender bias in facial analysis technology. Well, in that work, we're focused right now on developing tools and methods to reduce the harmful use of algorithmic systems and to ensure that communities are able to report and seek redress for the harms that they do experience when AI is deployed carelessly or when algorithmic systems are carelessly deployed. And you can learn more about that work at ajl.org. And our recommendations in this area are that we need to develop a much more robust ecosystem to minimize harms. That could include red teams, vulnerability bounties, independent audits to explore, test, and mitigate potential and actual real-world harms of MTech systems like AI. We think that people should explore and adopt the Design Justice Network principles, use the consentful technology guidelines, or otherwise adopt a racial and gender equity framework throughout the project lifecycle. And additionally, we think that we're going to need new laws and regulatory bodies to mitigate harms. And when people's data is used without their consent, legal action has to be part of the picture. Our second key finding is that context is key. And so here's a quote from Dragana Karin, the executive director of Localization Lab, talking about how they were doing some work with a popular messaging app, and they had to go back to an entirely Western group of developers and share with them that there were parts of the world where their tool was not working because people were using the tool in ways that they hadn't imagined, because what it looks like in the field is very different than what it looks like either in the lab or in one particular geopolitical context. So an emerging technology or an AI system that's useful might look really different in one place than in another. And the way that you can deal with that is by developing community partnerships that provide context and that will help you actually localize. For example, the Equitable Internet Initiative in Detroit is a great example of what happens when communities are appropriating technology for their own needs, building internet infrastructure in places that commercial providers have abandoned. And the EII is working with different neighborhood groups to ensure that more Detroit residents get access to technology, learn how to build and deploy network systems, and can more broadly leverage digital technologies for social and economic development. And our recommendations here are around supporting the leadership of community-based organizations and individuals who have really deep contextual knowledge and lived experience whenever you're deploying an AI system that is supposed to be for public good. There's a lot of recommendations in this space already. You could look at the More Than Code report, look for hashtag More Than Code or morethancode.cc, and if you want to dive into that more deeply. Our third key takeaway is that data is messy. And many of you will know this already. Here's a quote from Mimi Onuuha, who is an artist and researcher, who says, "What does it mean for us to make the world into data? And what happens when we do that? And what places get missed in that process?" So even as data drives so many of emerging technologies in the public interest, it's always incomplete, it's often misleading, it's difficult to maintain and protect, and data disparities lead to amplified inequalities. So many emerging technologies rely heavily on data, and in particular machine learning relies on large amounts of data to train models that can have great predictive power, but data is messy, it's uneven, it's often unavailable. It has to be gathered, cleaned, and maintained. It's always changing. Ongoing management can be very costly. And we're missing so much of the data that we might need to develop tech in the public interest. So for example, data sets about racial and gender equity are often difficult, expensive, or impossible to obtain. So good data about police violence, about worker fatalities, those things are often missing. For example, data for Black Lives called for states in the US to release COVID-19 data disaggregated by race. And they've been maintaining a record of which states have shared that data and which have not. We have a set of recommendations here. Again, we need a racial and gender equity framework specifically for data infrastructure. We need more transparency, more consent, and more accountability in how data is created, used, and shared. We believe that municipalities should develop comprehensive reviews of automated decision systems with racial, gender, disability, and economic justice lenses. We support community-led data projects, and we need more mechanisms for public oversight of the use of AI at the municipal level. The fourth recommendation is that community-led design can help us build a more just and sustainable world. Unfortunately, as Bertie Vidgen from the Alan Turing Institute said in our interview with them, computer scientists aren't always in dialogue with those who have deep domain knowledge, like social scientists or activists or cultural theorists, or even just people, everyday people whose lived experience is important. So for example, if you're looking at anti-Semitism, you're trying to develop an AI system that can help you detect anti-Semitism, you need to speak to the Jewish community and read that deep literature on anti-Semitism. But it doesn't always happen when computer scientists tackle such problems. Community-led design can provide pathways towards more just, equitable, and sustainable MTech. And those practices are moving into the mainstream, and that's a good thing. But shifting the overall field is going to take sustained effort and a lot of funding, a lot of training, and a lot of institutional commitment. We do see a lot of encouraging examples. For example, the Human Rights Data Analysis Group for decades has been working to apply statistical analysis to human rights cases, and they work closely with activists in different contexts. For example, in Mexico City, they worked with activists to help find the graves of disappeared people in Mexico City. So there's a lot of examples of what it looks like to do community partnership. But we think more broadly, people need to adopt the principle from the disability justice community and the disability rights movement of nothing about us without us. People need to partner with key stakeholders and people with lived experience of the challenge when developing AI for good. And we need to mainstream participatory design and community-led design methods across the field. Our fifth key takeaway is that sometimes snoozy is more important than sexy. And what we mean by that is that there are emerging tools, as Beth Cantor, who's an independent consultant, told us in her interview, there are emerging tools for fundraisers, for example, that use machine learning and AI to help them figure out who in the database is most likely to be a donor. And it's everyday administrative tasks of someone working in fundraising and development in a nonprofit that can be semi-automated or supported. And it's often these types of tools of everyday administration that make the deepest impact in public interest projects, more so than the headline-catching, sexy, or cutting-edge technologies. And so a lot of organizations need help to navigate through hype, automating administration, fundraising, content moderation, these types of things, rather than radically transformative tools that are sort of the stuff of sci-fi fantasies about AI. For example, Allison Fine and Beth Cantor wrote the Nonprofit AI Readiness Checklist for the M10 network. And that helps nonprofit staff consider how they might use AI and evaluate whether they actually have the internal capacity to develop the necessary data, the necessary ethical oversight to make that process sustainable and useful. I only have a few more minutes, so I'm going to go a little bit more quickly here. There are just 2 more top-level recommendations. So we also think we need a stronger community of practice. There's a lot of fragmentation, and we need a robust community of practitioners to meet and share information to harness MTech for the public interest more effectively. And in particular, there needs to be more opportunities for people from historically oppressed communities to be involved and to be given access to resources and leadership positions. There is a growing ecosystem of organizations. There are so many groups that we found in this work: the Algorithmic Justice League, Data for Black Lives, Black in AI, Girls Who Code, Black Girls Code, Lesbians Who Tech, the AI Now Institute, the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. It goes on and on and on. And you can find entries for many of these organizations on the website for the Emerging Technology Field Scan and on the Civic Tech Field Guide site. I'll share the link to that. Well, it's here, it's civictech.guide, and I'll share it again in a moment. And finally, we believe it's important to seek strategies for institutional transformation. So nonprofits and civil society groups do have to be actively involved in policy and in development and contributing data. Otherwise, community members and frontline communities get erased from the development of AI systems, even those that are positioned as being for good. So if we don't do this, we'll end up in 10 years with tools that are, or 5 years, that are making decisions without the people that the tools are meant to serve. And that's a quote from Marnie Webb, who's the Chief Community Impact Officer at TechSoup. And so we know that institutional transformation will be fundamental to effective and accountable use of AI in the public interest. So that means shifting policies and practices in companies, in nonprofits, in universities, and other organizations, as well as regulatory action at various levels of government. It's not enough to rely on the private sector to self-govern MTech in the public interest. We're going to need deeper institutional transformation, policy shifts, expanded legal and regulatory oversight to address algorithmic harms specifically and emerging technologies more broadly. So for example, the Shadow Report on the New York City Automated Decision System Task Force provides very detailed recommendations for policymakers and public about New York City's attempt to evaluate ADS across different city systems, which they find really lacking, and they present some proposals for other ways forward. We also believe that we need to organize a dedicated racial justice in tech fund in particular. We need to ensure that diversity, equity, and inclusion data about MTech programs sort of exists across the space. And we think there are a lot of useful frameworks that are already out there, and we share those in the report. You can find a lot more about the work that we did at mtechpathways.org. There's a special section of the Civic Tech Field Guide that catalogs hundreds of projects and examples at civictech.guide/mtech. We published the full interview transcripts from most of our interviewees on the site with brief summaries and longer transcripts. And you can learn more and access all of these resources, again, at mtechpathways.org. So thank you so much for inviting me here. I hope that this was helpful and useful, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sasha. Not just for an inspiring talk, but also for the resources that you shared with us, and they were really, really useful. If you have questions for Sasha, please follow them into the networking lounge speaker Q&A room using the link to that room, which is now being dropped into the session chat on Hopin. Sasha can then turn on their video camera and audio, and you can type questions in the session chat for Sasha to read out and answer. We'll be back after another 5-minute break. And in the interim, why not try out some one-to-one networking in the Networking Hub?